Last year, when Kristy Money was planning a baby naming ceremony in her Mormon congregation, she asked if she could hold her newborn during the ceremony, sitting or standing inside the circle of men who would bless her little daughter. "All I want is to hold my baby," Dr. Money, a 29-year-old psychologist in Santa Monica, California, said when she told her bishop. She said that he refused, explaining that only men who hold the priesthood could participate. When Dr. Money was told she could not hold her daughter Rosie at the church baby naming ceremony, she then held it in her home instead. And then the next month, she signed up with Miss Kate Kelly's group, Ordained Women. When advocates of female ordination asked for admittance to the male-only meetings at the church's semi-annual general conference, Dr. Money joined them, this time with baby Rosie in her arms.
I reached out to my bishop, like the New York Times said, and asked what seemed to be a reasonable request to just hold her, not even perform a blessing, just hold her for the blessing. And I'd heard about women historically who were able to do that, and I'd also watched deacons holding the microphone inside the center of the circle, and the microphone doesn't hold the priesthood, so I thought can I be in the center of that circle? But he said no, based on the handbook policy. And I was an active temple holding woman who had served a mission for the church and held callings, and I was the baby's own mother. Surely there had to be a place for me to participate in her blessing. But yeah, the short answer was no, based on the handbook. And I cried all day when he told me no. Nothing about that handbook policy felt right to my inner moral compass. Very similar to the handbook policy that we got last week. 2 months later, after I held her for the first time in my arms, I dreamt of what it would have been like to participate with my husband in a chapel in a day so important to LDS ritual. And I also realized at the same time those were dreams, that I would not be able to hold her like that. We did do it at home, and it was a beautiful experience. I highly recommend it. But after I'd had a relatively idyllic life in the LDS church. I had never felt unequal in any way. But a very sober truth hit me like a ton of bricks. With that experience, and we found in that the Mormon gender survey that this is very similar. That most women, for the first time, they experience or they see gender inequality for the first time with the naming and blessing ceremony. And that sobering truth to me was that there are structural inequalities and differences between how men and women are treated in the church. The activist in me was born with Rosie. There was an important night in my life and my husband's life, who's here with me. It was March 17th, 2013. It was a late night for us in that tiny UCLA family housing apartment. I remember saying, are we ready for this? Because it was the launch of the Ordained Women site. And we both knew Kate and her husband, Neil, from our BYU days, and we really wanted the equality movement to flourish. And it was so badly, for both of our kids, for Rosie and our other daughter, Evie. So we were excited and also scared to death about what that would mean for us as organizers. So now let's jump almost exactly 1 year later, on March 6, 2014. That was the New York Times interview, and so I and other brave Mormon women, including Nylan, they were interviewed for that article. And we talked about some of Mormon women's concerns about gender inequality, and my heart was pounding as I got that hard copy with my picture and holding Rosie, and my heart pounded even more when, like, at first there was silence, like radio silence, which, I mean, I was kind of expecting something, but there was like crickets, and then like 3 or 4 days later, that's when all of a sudden the floodgates opened about, you know, how can you do this? You know, don't air our dirty laundry, and I was just trying to help, but it was a hard week for us. But let's see. Interestingly, we are now 1.5 years after that article was published. Half of the inequalities that the reporter Lori Goodstein mentioned were highlighted. You know, the baby blessings was one of them, but there were I counted 11. Half of them have been addressed. So, for example, portraits of female leaders now hang in the conference center along with male leaders. The centerfold gallery of church leaders in the Ensign Church magazine began to include photos of female leaders. During General Conference, female auxiliary leaders were moved to a position of prominence in the center of the conference section. Women have been formally invited into ward-level meetings for planning sacrament services. CES changed its policy banning women with small children from teaching seminary and institute full-time. We have female ushers in the conference center, and the most recent announcement about female auxiliaries being invited to participate in previously male-only meetings. Now, whether or not they, it seems with the rhetoric of presiding that they wouldn't have the ultimate say, and I am very curious about if women were involved at all in the most recent handbook change, but that has yet to be seen. We will hopefully hear more about that. And also, let me be clear, I'm not saying that OW is responsible for these changes. The credit for these changes goes squarely on those in church administration who decide to implement them. The church could have ignored these nationally recognized issues, but it didn't. It responded to the needs of women's voices, including those within OW, as well as the general Mormon public. You know, as we've seen in blogs, in podcasts, and the conversations going on in ward buildings throughout the world. So this is a needed, crucial conversation, which, as we just saw, has already produced some productive baby steps. As I think back to Rosie's blessing ceremony, which started me along this path, it gets me thinking about the twins that I'm carrying right now. I don't know what I'm going to do about their ceremony. Actually, I've thought a lot about it. I'm just trying to focus on staying healthy while growing two human beings inside of me. It would be great if the blessing policy changed between now and their blessing days. But even if nothing changes, I don't regret speaking up about my experience, because I was my authentic self, and by speaking up, we also hold those perpetuating inequality directly responsible. And when they take responsibility and respond, the future is brighter for the next generation. But even if the church doesn't respond, and they may never do that soon enough, for those of us raising kids who have nieces or who have nephews or grandchildren, that it might not happen. But even so, the next generation benefits from your courageous example for them as you assign responsibility appropriately and take the reins of your own life and move forward authentically. We've asked, the answers haven't come. They may never come. Except in the form of quoting the handbook, which we saw in the latest essay on women and authority in the priesthood. That handbook policy, yeah. But we can still move forward as individuals and as a body of LDS women. So this, I believe, is the next necessary step in this conversation. So moving from my own story, this is where I see us moving forward. Drawing on my practice as a psychologist working with LDS women, I want to talk about the capacity each of us here, right now, hold as women to claim power and authority in our lives as Mormon women. By listening to our inner voice and following it, rather than obediently looking to authority for the answers. It was critical and a necessary step, I believe, to articulate and put forward an ideal of equality. And that's already happened. OW has made its organizational focus over the last several years to point out clearly the ways in which the positions of men and women in the LDS Church are structurally not equal. We've done that. The problem is, those who hold institutional power don't seem to respond when we simply make arguments about equality. They, and everyone around you, start to notice when we embody it. When a critical mass of people began to embody equality for ourselves, claiming their power and calling on those in power to recognize what we know, that we are equal, instead of asking for it and waiting, that's when, as the anthropologist Margaret Mead said, we begin to see small groups of concerned citizens changing the world. Let me give you an example. Ever since the Mormon Women and the Priesthood Authority essay came out, I have witnessed dozens of active Mormon women boldly leading out and making it clear that they have given and they've given healing and comfort blessings, those same blessings mentioned in the essay that church leaders said, yeah, but we don't do that anymore. These women are saying, I've done that and I will continue to do that. They had been doing it secretly, but now they're using their real names in the bloggernacle, as Phil mentioned earlier, and they're being open about claiming and utilizing the divine power that they recognize in themselves. So, I mean, and in the wake of last week's change in policy for LDS children of LGBT families, many other courageous women have stated that they will come forward and they will perform the naming and blessing ceremonies that the handbook has forbidden these families and their babies. So, I am proud of my friends. They are brave, and as Terry Tempest Williams said recently, they aren't waiting for a revelation, they are leading a revolution. This process of taking power, as you can see, it's not easy as it sounds. There are several significant cultural roadblocks that can keep this from happening, and I could go on for hours about that, but from my practice as a therapist and my work as a qualitative researcher, focused on women's issues, I've come to believe that there's one thing above all that holds us back, and that is shame. There are so many reasons why I've seen LDS women feel shamed into making choices that are different from those they wanted to make. Shame into accepting others' roadmap for them instead of claiming their own. We're taught from when we're little to put others' needs and expectations above our own, and we're also taught that as girls and women that we're naturally better at that kind of thing anyway. Mormon culture is excellent at clearly articulating cultural norms. I mean, you got to give them credit. Like, they're pretty upfront about what those cultural norms are, and making it very clear what we need to say and do to be part of the group. It's been made clear to all of us, men and women, just recently, and in that newsroom release, actually, that we can think however we want, but that if we act on those beliefs and thoughts, we open ourselves to sanction, both formal and informal, in the form of exclusion and shame. And the consequences for veering from the tribal path are very severe. Study after psychological study has shown that social rejection feels like a physical injury, and I felt that in my own life. As a psychologist, I want to go on record to say that our mental health suffers when we don't allow our beliefs and inner voice to mirror our actions and how we present ourselves to the world. Peace comes from aligning our inner voice with our behavior. It's freeing, it's beautiful, it's the authentic life, and shame is what those in power use to keep others in line. So, and sadly, this happens often unconsciously. And despite doctrinal claims that would seem to promote inclusion, Mormon culture could be better. Could be just a little bit better at making room for those who don't fit those norms to reliably feel safe, to feel needed, to feel enough, just the way they are. In my work as a therapist, this has become my primary focus. helping women to identify, name, and overcome these feelings of shame, which has been most successful when clients come to claim their own power for themselves by developing radical acceptance, and I'll talk about that more in just a second. But at first, identifying this shame can be difficult. In Mormon culture, we are taught at length regarding sin. Shame is then often misunderstood as a natural consequence of bad choices, and that's supposed to lead us to make better ones. Shame is not productive. Shame is not our conscience telling us what we can and should do better. Shame is what we are made to feel when we don't fit an arbitrary, pre-designed ideal, and when we publicly admit to wanting what culturally we're not supposed to want. Your conscience encourages you to do what you feel is right. Shame is encouragement to fit in, independent of rightness or wrongness. So once we understand what shame is, we can name it. We can directly identify it for the oppressive, hurtful thing that it is. The womanist scholar Bell Hooks calls this empowering process naming our pain. Before we can change our reality, we must be able to see it clearly and to give a name to that which is keeping us back. So, there's power in identifying and naming shame for what it is, because now that you see it, you can't unsee it, and you can overcome it. And so the way away from shame is through power, through recognizing that no matter what our religious institutions do, there is power there to embrace, power which a loving God extends to us as part of our divine inheritance. It's recognizing our access to that power, embracing it. That's, I think, radical acceptance. To go even further, Marsha Linehan, the founder of dialectical therapy, developed this idea of radical acceptance, which she mostly applied to families, but I think it applies to religion as well. That basically the theory goes that families, loved ones, and institutions will do some things that will really hurt you. You can let it get under your skin, and you can ruminate about it. You can try to change them, or you can claim the power you have in the relationship by saying, through your own actions, that their actions are simply not acceptable. And then you come to terms with how, even though you don't have control over what the other party decides to do, you can control how you react to them. Either with continual asking and inevitable hurt, or with healthy boundaries. And so, in other words, you can take protective measures for your own mental health and vow not to repeat those patterns for yourself. And for your family as you move on with your life. And so therein lies your power, right there for the claiming. We have precedents for this in our theology and history as LDS women. It's filled with powerful stories of women who recognized their own divinity and took their own power. So, Eve didn't follow the script laid out for her. Not at all. And Emma Smith, despite being taught repeatedly by her husband, the prophet, that polygamy was a sacred principle that she needed to accept, in the end refused to do so, as we learned earlier today. She was following her own conscience. In our day, we have many women we can look to as examples of choosing to do what you feel is right. Many are in this room right now. Jill and Nylan and Fiona and Maxine Hanks and Deborah Jensen and so many others. We need to stand on the shoulders of these women that came before us, just like our daughters and granddaughters will continue the process on our own shoulders. The way we make that change is to show up, to stop being afraid of our whole selves, to publicly express the desires of our hearts and act accordingly. If we do this over and over, the men in power will begin to realize that we are not going away. Shame won't work. But then I don't want to focus on those men in power, because this honestly is not about them. When we focus on leaders, we focus on what we can do to influence their behavior. And we end up in this place where we spend enormous emotional and physical energy reaching out to our leaders and asking them to please answer us. Why do we ask? By asking, we reinforce the power dynamics that make up the current unequal status quo. And as I've seen firsthand from my time on the executive board of OW, we've learned some lessons over the years. And one of them is that asking isn't as effective of a strategy as I had originally hoped. I admit, I was idealistic when we started out. I thought if I shared my concerns, that if only those in power knew what the issues were with women faced, if only they could see the pain, they would change policies. And they may someday, but they may not. But we have shifted the language we're using somewhat. We're saying now that as we move forward, we call upon those in authority to recognize the power and authority that we know that we have. Not just as we do what we are told and presided over in our church callings, but acting independently. And even if they don't, we're still exercising it. We're listening to that inner voice and we're following it. So whether or not you feel a pull toward full equality for all, it's all right. I mean, there's space for everyone, and you can do the same in your own life by recognizing, naming those aspects in your life that, as an LDS woman, are keeping you from being what you long to be, and then you can choose to obey or not. I don't know if you've heard the saying, Mormons gotta morm. Ever heard that? Usually when we're bringing casseroles or playing competitive church basketball. Anyway, my take on it is, if you're gonna morm on your own terms. and therein we Mormon women claim our real power and authority, and will lead out for the next generation. I really believe that. I want that so much for my daughters. My two at home and the two babies right here with me. Watching my two girls in the world, they are bright. They're inquisitive. They're full of wonder and courage. They're only 4 and 2, but I see it. I see it already. And I would imagine nothing is impossible in their eyes.